Okay, so you want to own a data center. Rows of servers humming away in a windowless building, renting out rack space and compute to companies who will pay almost anything to keep their systems running without interruption.
In the age of AI, it's the closest thing to owning the plumbing underneath the entire digital economy. Everyone needs it, nobody sees it. The checks arrive every single month, whether anyone notices your building exists.
That is the dream. And it is not entirely wrong. Here's what it doesn't tell you. This is one of the only businesses in the world where the building itself can bankrupt you, even while every tenant inside it keeps paying rent on time.
Let's start with what it costs to build one. Industry data from 2025 and 2026 put standard shell and core data center construction at $10 to $12 million per megawatt. And AI-optimized facilities with liquid cooling and high-density racks can run $20 million per megawatt or more.
A modest 100-megawatt hyperscale facility, now the standard unit of deployment for major cloud and AI companies, costs $900 million to $1.5 billion just to build. On a square footage basis, that's $600 to $1,100 per gross square foot. And electrical systems alone eat up 40 to 45% of that budget, since utility interconnection, switchgear, backup generators, and power distribution dwarf the cost of the actual building shell, which is only 10 to 15% of the total.
Land itself has become genuinely scarce. Average data center land prices hit $244,000 per acre in 2024, and large parcels of 50-plus acres are up 23% year over year as demand for prime, grid-connected sites collides with a shrinking supply of them.
Before you pour a single foundation, you need something even scarcer than land: power.
By 2022 and 2023, building a new data center required the local utility to physically extend the grid to your site and approve the load. And utility interconnection alone can run $5 to $25 million, depending on how far you are from existing capacity. Equipment lead times compound the problem. Transformers, generators, and cooling systems can take up to 18 months to procure, forcing operators to order critical equipment before the site design is even finalized, which is exactly the kind of decision that turns a modest cost overrun into a catastrophic one if plans change midstream. Add permitting, environmental assessments, and Uptime Institute tier certification, where moving from Tier 3 to Tier 4 redundancy standards alone adds 15 to 40% to total construction cost, and you can spend hundreds of millions of dollars before a single server rack is powered on. Once it's running, the cost structure shifts to something more predictable, but still brutal. Electricity is the largest recurring expense, running $1 to $5 million per megawatt annually, depending on region and efficiency. Operators live and die by a metric called power usage effectiveness, where a well-run facility hits close to 1.2, and an inefficient one can run above 2.0, meaning it burns nearly twice as much power on cooling and overhead as it delivers to actual computing. Staffing, security, and round-the-clock monitoring add another 10 to 20% of annual operating costs. None of this is optional. And unlike a warehouse sitting half empty, an idle rack in a data center still needs full power redundancy, full cooling, and full security, whether a single customer is using it or not. Here's where the money actually comes from, and it flows through a few very different layers. The core is colocation rent, where enterprise customers pay to house their own servers inside your facility, priced by rack space and power draw. Layered on top is interconnection revenue, charging customers a premium to physically cross-connect their servers to cloud providers or other tenants inside the same building without routing traffic over the public internet, a service that commands outsized margins because it takes almost no additional space to deliver, much like a mall's kiosk earning more per square foot than a full storefront.
Then there's wholesale leasing to hyperscalers, cloud giants who lease entire buildings or campuses outright on long-term contracts. And finally, managed services, where operators charge extra for monitoring, security, and maintenance customers would otherwise have to staff themselves. The entire model depends on filling and refilling that expensive shell continuously, because every idle megawatt of capacity is, as one industry analysis put it, millions of dollars in investment earning zero return. Now the disaster case study, and it's a lesson in how the wrong side of a balance sheet can sink an otherwise thriving business. Cyxtera Technologies was formed in 2016 when Medina Capital and BC Partners bought CenturyLink's data center portfolio for $2.15 billion, building it into the third largest retail colocation operator in the United States, with over 60 facilities and more than 2,300 customers. Unlike most competitors, Cyxtera didn't own most of its real estate. It leased it, carrying roughly $1.4 billion in future lease payments that were fixed and non-cancelable no matter what happened to revenue. When the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates aggressively, Cyxtera's annualized interest expense on its floating rate debt more than doubled, from $35.9 million in early 2022 to $75.7 million by early 2023. While roughly $1.2 billion in loan maturities converged on a single deadline in 2024. The business itself was not failing. Demand for colocation was strong, and the company still pulled in $746 million in revenue in 2022. But the capital structure underneath it, floating rate debt and locked-in lease obligations that couldn't flex, meant rising rates alone were enough to push the company into Chapter 11 bankruptcy in June 2023. It was eventually sold to Brookfield for $775 million, a fraction of what it would take to rebuild that footprint from scratch. And unsecured creditors recovered a mere $8.65 million against more than $307 million in claims. The lesson isn't that data centers are a bad business. It's that leased buildings financed with variable rate debt turn an otherwise stable, monopoly-like income stream into something that can be destroyed entirely by a decision made at a Federal Reserve meeting, with the operator having no control over it whatsoever. Let's run the numbers on two scenarios. Optimistic case, you build a 20 megawatt facility for $220 million, financed with fixed rate debt on land you own outright. You lease it out at 90% utilization to a mix of colocation and hyperscale tenants, generating $40 million a year in revenue, against $18 million in power, staffing, and maintenance costs, leaving a $22 million annual margin. A genuinely durable return on a fixed-cost asset with long-term, sticky tenants who rarely leave once their servers are physically installed. Realistic case, the same facility, but built on leased land with floating-rate financing to preserve capital up front, common in a capital-intensive industry racing to keep up with AI demand. Interest rates rise 2 percentage points over 3 years. Your debt service costs balloon by millions annually, while your lease payments stay fixed regardless of occupancy. Even at the same 90% utilization and the same $40 million in revenue, your net margin can evaporate entirely once the true cost of variable debt is accounted for. Exactly the mechanism that took down Cyxtera, despite genuinely strong underlying demand. So if you decide to own a data center, understand what you're actually buying. You're not buying a building full of servers. You're buying a fixed, illiquid, power-hungry asset that only works financially if your debt and your leases can survive a decade of interest rate cycles you have no control over. Get the capital structure right, and you own one of the most durable, monopoly-like income streams in modern infrastructure. Get it wrong, and a thriving, fully occupied business can still end up in bankruptcy court.